It's really great to see so many of you here, and I know also to welcome those who are joining online. I know we've got a really good audience for today online as well. A small piece of housekeeping, just a reminder that those of you who have signed up for the early career lunch afterwards, that will be happening in the seminar room. If you haven't signed up, please resist grabbing the sandwiches. They're for group of people. But everyone else is very welcome to stick around for discussion afterwards here and next door in the common room. I'm Chris Sandbrook in the Department of Geography at the University of Cambridge, and it's my enormous pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Melissa Leach, who is the newly appointed Executive Director of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. She's been with us since the beginning of June. Prior to joining us in Cambridge, she was the Director of the Institute for Development Studies down in Sussex for more than 10 years, been the Director of the ESRC STEP Centre, doing really cutting-edge research. And so she's had an impressive set of leadership roles and experiences over several decades. But throughout that time, she's also kept up a very impressive research career. She's a social scientist who's done ethnographic work in West Africa for 30 years. She's made major contributions to the field, particularly in my research area of political ecology. She's made contributions such as Lie of the Land, Misreading the African Landscape, papers on green grabbing, a whole set of articles and books, which I have to say, I don't think I've ever produced a reading list for students that hasn't had some of Melissa's work on it. that says a lot about her work, I think. But it's also been incredibly policy relevant and applied. So she's worked on issues such as Ebola in West Africa. She's a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food. So she's really applied her research as well into practice. And for all those reasons, I think we're incredibly lucky to have her here now as our new Executive Director of CCI. I could really go on and on singing her praises, but I won't because we don't have to. I'll just hand over to you, Melissa. Welcome. Thank you very much.
It's lovely to see everyone. And since arriving at CCI, I've had so many conversations with so many of you in this room and various others about a lot of different things. But this is a chance, in a way, to go back and tell you a little bit more about where I'm coming from in some of this, and to do what feels like, in a way, a kind of bit of a review of my own journey, but also one that I think updates in quite interesting ways to some of the work and debates that seem to me to be alive and well in CCI at the moment. So I called it West Africa's Upper Guinean Forests and Beyond, and this is also partly about forests, but it's also beyond forests. Forests are a thing I've worked on a lot through my career, and they're good to think with and good to work with and important. Forests and the people who live in with them, I think, are under global policy spotlight, research spotlight as never before. We've got forest-human interaction seen as part of the dynamics and the problems in the world related to climate change, related to planetary predicaments, biodiversity loss. They're also celebrated for contributing to the solutions, fixing carbon, sustaining water and life, contributing to multiple sustainable development goals, as long as they're well stewarded, well managed. And the centrality of local communities, indigenous peoples to such stewardship is now absolutely recognised in long-standing schemes in conservation, advocacy for community forest management, community engagement in forest protection and enhancement, as well, of course, as in the claims and movements of forest communities and indigenous people themselves, something I think we'll see really foregrounded next week as COP16 on biodiversity takes off, and it's really important Article 22, which really underlines the importance of equity and inclusion. But we see that importance too in the critique of fortress forest protection schemes that do actually exclude and dispossess those very communities, becoming what colleagues and I more than a decade ago now termed green grabbing, as Chris has emphasised, defined as we did then as the appropriation of nature for environmental ends. Analysed further in a book I did with many African collaborators in 2015 on the conflicts around carbon and carbon schemes in African settings. And then much more recently, just this year, with my colleagues in the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, where we looked at how the proliferation of nature finance schemes, carbon markets, and big area-based conservation could be seen as forming part of a kind of green grabbing 2.0, often squeezing the land and forest access, control and use, especially by smallholders and indigenous groups. So some of those experiences have led me, I think, always to ask, as we must, whose forest, whose goals? And there, I think livelihoods approaches have been really important. So people in CCI working livelihoods and forest livelihoods and ensuring them. This is just one framework which actually came out of my group at IDS a way back, the work of Ian Scoons and others, which highlights the multiple benefits that people get from forests, the importance of a huge variety of services and goods for livelihoods, the individuals, households and communities involved, the different kinds of capitals and how people combine them, often in quite complex and dynamic ways, to survive, hopefully to thrive, and the governance contexts and institutions always involved in those things. And livelihoods perspectives too interlink with really important calls for equity and justice in forest stewardship and interventions as more broadly, and indeed in arguments for what people are now calling just transitions in sustainability generally. So we can ask, as I did with my colleagues in Future Earth a few years ago, equity of what for whom? We can pull out different dimensions and their intersections. We can elaborate on the original framework that Nancy Fraser proposed, which distinguishes between distributional justice, about who gets what, procedural justice, about how decisions are made about these things, recognitional justice, asking who and what are included. And we can envisage combining those and applying them, as in this image, which comes from a forest protection scheme in Sierra Leone in the Western area, where you've got a situation where a forest landscape has multiple goals and values, which are important in different ways to different groups. So we need to think about who's included, whose values are recognized, about equitable distribution of those goals and the procedures that enable those things to happen. And I think the point I want to make is that across the world, there are many, many examples now, some of them being put forward by CCI partners that are trying to apply, and I think succeeding in applying best practice in this kind of approach and framework. But my question today, and where I've sort of come to in my kind of thinking and career, is that is this enough? Appreciation of forest livelihoods and livelihoods in other areas, and the dimensions of justice in conservation that flow from that is necessary, but perhaps I think not sufficient. So we need greater understanding of what in this seminar I'm going to call forest lifeways, arguing that livelihoods, which foreground in particular the more immediate socioeconomic benefits and rights that flow from them, are part of this, but not all. So what do I mean by lifeways? I'm talking about two particular moves, and this is the first one. It's to see how livelihoods and people's lives are embedded within what we might call life worlds, worldviews of the people who live with and engage with them. These are grounded in everyday experiences. They're sometimes elaborated on what we might identify as indigenous philosophies or cosmologies, different ways of knowing, ways of being, modes of experience. Importantly, they don't necessarily, and in fact most often do not, follow the kind of boundaries between nature and culture, the human and the non-human, that we're used to for those of us who are educated and think through post-Enlightenment Western science. But they place people instead as what these days I tend to call nature kind, within more than human relationships and assemblages that include plants, animals, insects, earths, rocks, water, spiritual beings, and more. In African context, the Cameroonian anthropologist Francis Nyamjo, I think, captures this really well in what he calls conviviality. Well, in Bantu context, we see people at Etiebo elaborating on Ubuntu ways of being, using that word to capture the ways in which all beings, including humans, gods, spirits, animals, and inanimate beings, belong together in a community of beings. So we've got a different version of community going on there, a more than human community. And there are innumerable versions, and people will elaborate in different ways precisely what beings are there and what are relevant. in what we might understand as a diversity of worlds within a pluriverse, a cultural diversity that extends across local communities and indigenous peoples for sure, but we might also see as extending into all of our everyday lives everywhere, something that we might find inside ourselves or in the bits of our lives that haven't been wiped out by the formal education and science that we might take on board in other aspects of our lives. And I'll come back to that. But importantly, in coming back to forests, all of this highlights interconnected relational experiences in which people are part and parcel of forest landscapes. They're not either separate or a disturbing external element. So the second bit of a kind of lifeways approach is to see these life worlds as embedded in space and embedded in time. The interconnections between different beings are sometimes literally inscribed in place in the landscape, maybe through particular vegetation types, through sacred places, sacred trees, and so on. And as historical ecologists have long recognized, past events often leave their mark, and these can build up over time, so that the forest itself becomes almost like an archive, something through which we can read and appreciate these layered legacies. And forests and the people who live with them, we can thus see as kind of entangled in these pathways of change, often responding to these interlocking events in ways that then set the stage for change and for what's come next. So this is what I mean by kind of forest pathways, and it's a key part of forest lifeways. I think the other element, which I'll also come back to, is that people will often memorialize and make space for these kinds of markers and layered legacies. They sometimes become part of what we might think of as socio-natural heritage, and they become part of people's claims and identities in relation to place and in relation to territory. And crucially, what's gone before also influences what people feel might come in the future, what's desirable or possible, what's dangerous, what's imaginable or unimaginable. So pathways are not just of the past, they move us forward as well. So let's turn to some stories which begin to ground what I'm talking about. And they come from different parts of the pluriverse. They show that viewed through what I'm calling a lifeways lens, forests aren't always what they seem. And they challenge especially some of these taken for granted assumptions that somehow forests are nature and people disturb them. And as I'll come to at the end, they challenge this kind of tripartite Fraser framework for thinking about equity and justice, foregrounding some additional dimensions that I think if we want to build what we might call conservation justice or decolonial environmental justice, to pick up on another phrase, we need to take perhaps more seriously. So these are stories that emerge partly from my own work, my ethnographic work, my collaborations with colleagues in the UK, particularly James Fairhead, later James Fraser, but particularly the collaborations with our Mende, Karanko, Loma, Kissi inhabitants in the forest worlds that we explored with them. And then I'll turn more briefly to a couple of cases drawing on other work and personal experiences from North America and from the southern UK. So West Africa, this is the Upper Guinean forest. It's familiar to many people in CCI. It's the tri-border zone between Guinea, Liberia and Sierra Leone. It's the focus of the West African Nature Transformations Initiative. It's a super hot biodiversity hotspot by any account. And over the last decade, it's been a target for nature-based solutions and carbon schemes too. And forest here is usually portrayed as highly degraded from something that's imagined as its original extent, as in this map. A set of assumptions that, as I'm going to illustrate, a lifeways perspective finds some pretty fundamental calls to question. So let's begin in Guinea, just that side of the border, in Ziama. Close to the Liberian border, a forest reserve in Guinea, where fauna and flora and other partners work, that's also part of transboundary reserve plans. And this dense semi-deciduous forest, with its important populations, both of rare endemic birds, of reptiles and of forest elephants, is under huge current pressure. And the pressure is coming from many things, from conversion to commercial agriculture, in a region impoverished over decades by extractive mining, by economic decline. And Fauna and Flora is working here with the Centre Forestier de Zérecouré to engage the Loma communities in forest protection, including with alternative livelihoods to try and reduce smallholder farming in the buffer zone and reduce the pressure on the forest. The project communications, like this one here, often present this as a pristine forest coming under pressure as if for the first time. Yet this happens to be a forest area whose history is particularly well documented, not just in the oral traditions of the Loma people who live now in small villages around the edge of this reserve and its buffer zone, but also the travel accounts of 3 Americo-Liberians who in the mid-19th century walked through the region from the coast up into what's now Guinea, and described in their accounts not forest, but instead some really large settlements, 3,000 people, 5,000 people, wealth, women dripping with gold, trading goods, because these were on the paths of trans-African trade routes involving gold, slaves, palm kernels. And these big settlements weren't in forest. They were in pretty much wall-to-wall rice fields. Yet with the late 19th century wars associated with the colonization of this region and it splitting up into a French and British and American settlement, the region suffered enormous economic decline and population decline. And forest basically started to regrow over these farms and many abandoned settlements. So that by the 1930s, when French colonial foresters such as Aubreville arrived and sought to conserve these growing forests as part of what was then imagined to be a curtain of forest reserves to stop the southwards march of the deserts of the Sahel, it was respectably dense enough to do that. And by the time sort of a more modern era of conservation began from the 1970s, when Ziama was first declared a biosphere reserve by UNESCO, it was very respectable high forest, replete with animal populations, and easy to kind of assume or not question whether it had been there like that all along. Yet the villagers now living in the buffer zone haven't forgotten. And taking the accounts to them, which we did in the early 90s when we were in the region, stimulated the retelling of stories of decline, as well as a lot of rich discussions of the markers of Ziama's earlier more than human cohabitation. People would point to the remains of mud and in nearby Palika, just across the Liberian border, stone fortifications. They'd point to rings of cotton trees, Ciba pentandra, that linked to ancestors, or to Colanitida trees, which linked to current people, as mothers would often plant the umbilical cord of a baby around a tree, so that the tree would grow up as sort of almost embodiment of the person who that umbilical cord would become. They would point out places used as seclusion for grave sites and cultural initiations. And all of these would leave vegetational legacies, linking also to the presence of metaphysical power in the landscape, known as Kale and Sale in Loma language, a feature of ancestors, of trees, and of ritual objects. Families retained connections to those sites, understandably, they remembered them, but they were excluded from them by the forest reservation that happened. And in the 1990s, this became such a source of resentment and tension with the then European project, known as Projet4, that's an acronym, that Projet4 became known colloquially as Projet Mort in French, a dead project. Such were the tensions and conflicts with forest guards. And as elders put it then, basically they said, give us back control over the forest and we'll look after it. The claim to control, I think, was about far more than livelihood. It was about this heritage, this memorialization, these political claims. And tensions simmer to this day, although they're often obscured or sort of pushed to the background amidst the very upbeat project discourses of co-management, of livelihood benefits, and indeed some really well-intentioned and actually quite very sensitive efforts to explain things like carbon markets and how to benefit from them to the small villages that are now in the area. But forest landscapes are archives of such layered history and more than human worlds, important to the feelings of belonging and memory and status of families living nearby, is echoed if we move just across in this tri-border region to Sierra Leone. And this is the Gola Forest area where I lived and worked as a naive anthropology PhD student in the late 80s, with Mende people, learning about gender relations and how people fished and hunted and engaged with the forest and farm interface. At the same time as just a kind of couple of chieftains away, the RSPB and the Conservation Society of Sierra Leone were getting interested in the biodiversity, especially the kind of endemic and extremely rare flagship bird, the white-necked Picathartes gymnocephalus, which is still the emblem of what several decades later is a flagship conservation project and indeed a forest carbon project. In 2012, this became the first REDD+ program in West Africa, and is going to be celebrated as such at COP16 in a couple of weeks' time. And the Gola Rainforest Programme, now managed in a complex partnership involving local organisations and chieftains, is rightly known for its really socioeconomically well-informed livelihood benefit sharing schemes and its very careful navigation of diverse local authorities in striving for procedural equity, distributional equity, and how those benefits are managed and shared. But again, there are less often told stories. So elders, when I was living there in the late 80s, would talk of driving back the Gola people who first inhabited those areas. And they would show me as we walked in the forest, the war fences, the relics of the mud walls and thorn bushes that were the settlements of those Gola people. That was a fleeing that was repeated in the Civil War of 1991 to 2002 in Sierra Leone, although by that time people weren't living in the forest because it had become a reserve. There are the stories too of the Kamajo, Mende traditional hunters, members of a brotherhood like Safa Kane here, with whom back then in the 80s, I would walk learning from him about the spirits, about the metaphysical powers of the Hale in the forest, and whose ways of knowing and relating with animals and of killing with a kind of respect, contrasted with what Safa would continually disparage as those young men with guns who just go out and shoot monkeys to make money. There was a difference in ways of relating. And forest protection and the outlawing of shotguns after the Civil War, which was done for peace reasons as much as forest protection reasons, isn't just the loss of livelihood for someone like Safa. It's the loss of a quite important set of statuses, something he's recaptured in a different way and becoming imam. There are stories too of the women whose fishing, which I often spent time doing back then, depended on navigating with water beings like Mami Wata, and for whom power was deeply enwrapped, inseparable from their initiation society, the Sunday Society, whose masks, again imbued with metaphysical power, invoke the fertility of both people and the codependent non-human world that was essential to their survival. So when today's community members in the Gola area ask, as they sometimes do, what has Gola ever done for us? They seem to allude to this more embedded and in place sense of ownership and belonging, which in local view doesn't really seem to be able to be compensated by the shares of livelihood benefits that are coming from the project. Contributions to community projects, to school fees and so on. They're fine, but there's something different going on. There's somehow a broader sense of justice that seems to be at stake. We can move north too, and here we find in the Guinean part of this zone, a typical landscape, which is not dense forest today. It's a mosaic. It's a mosaic captured on the cover of the sort of main book I was engaged in about this work, where the red are patches of forest, for islands of forest around settlements in a sea of blue of grassland savanna. And external scientists and policymakers since the 1890s have repeatedly assumed those forest islands to be the last relics of the great forest cover that once covered the region. something destroyed by shifting conservation, by fire setting, by unruly timber felling. Always in the last couple of decades, a continually updated myth of a landscape half empty and emptying with forests. It was recently updated in the context of the Ebola epidemic in West Africa as a supposed explanation for the origins of that epidemic in Ground Zero, a village called Meliandu, which was about 5 miles from the villages where I'd lived in Kisidugu Prefecture in Guinea. And there it was argued that, again, we see this story about rapid recent deforestation. Here, supposedly bringing people and bats in forests into contact for the first time, and allowing a viral spillover located particularly to a small child who was supposedly playing with a free-tailed bat in a hollow tree to become patient zero of what became a big epidemic, killing upwards of 11,000 people and leaving many more survivors grappling with symptoms. But again, this is a narrative that is not supported by historical evidence. So this is the village of Meliandu, which hadn't experienced dramatic forest loss. In fact, these aerial photographs show that there'd been really almost no vegetation change over the past 35 years, leading up to that moment when Ebola was supposed to have spilt over there. And what those narratives of decline and spillover fuel is both everyday human bat conviviality. People have lived with bats in these forests and landscapes over centuries. They're just part of life. And also local origin stories for Ebola, which focus on very different things, on human to human transmission, and a story of the arrival of a woman from a mining area, probably bringing a virus that originated and originally spilt over on the other side of the African continent. We can talk a little bit more about that if people are interested. So these are, again, these forest islands are the results of settlement not existing despite it. The sort of debunking of that narrative of forest decline has been a major effort of my team over a long period. And that ethnographic and everyday participant observation with people as they lived in settlements and around revealed instead a landscape half full and filling with forest, where Kisi and Karanko villagers would relate how their ancestors settled in savanna and how woody vegetation formed through the encouraging of woody vegetation at wall fences, the training of some trees to become lookout posts by trimming their apical stems, the encouragement of cotton trees to form fortifications through training them to branch, a formation people call forearms or bolonani, the soil transformations that would occur as a result of women deposing the waste and the ash from cooking fires behind their kitchens and then gardening in those soils so that they become black and dark and super fertile, but also substrates where woody vegetation can take root really easily as compared with the surrounding savannas. And then the creation of almost natural fire breaks so that when dry season fires sweep through, they wouldn't get to these woody patches, and so they would grow and flourish. And again, the forest islands that result archive this kind of history. As we walk through them, people would point out these lookout trees, they'd point out the legacies of ancestral graves, they'd point out the cola and coffee trees that they'd planted. And sometimes they would protect those forest islands for that reason. Sometimes villages would move, as people would sometimes to take them nearer to a road or because of political tensions within a chiefdom. And those abandoned settlements would retain their distinctive vegetation and soils, sometimes protected for those political reasons as markers, sometimes partially converted to make space for farming, but always remembered within a mosaic landscape that is not just a set of vegetational patches, but also very much a landscape which embodies social and political histories and relations between the families that once lived there. So let's move to some other places and think about lifeways. Here I'm moving into North America and to a work that I've had nothing directly to do with, but have been very inspired by. The accounts of Robin Kimmerer, who is both a biologist and a member of the Potawatomi Nation, who provides, again, really striking stories of what I'm terming forest lifeways, revealing these kind of dynamics of more than human worlds over time. And one of her kind of cases concerns the pecan groves, which sort of interlake the prairies of the American Midwest. And the pecans all fruit together at the same time, at sort of unpredictable intervals every few years. A boom and bust cycle known as mass fruiting, which ecologists have interpreted through a kind of predator-prey hypothesis, a kind of quite classic ecological explanation configured in a dynamic between trees and squirrels and their predators. And we might envisage in that framing people's livelihoods hitching onto it so that they benefit too from this kind of abundant harvest. But Kimmerer finds that explanation wanting, and she turns instead to a much more relational set of accounts, which draw both on more recent biology and what's being understood now about the fungal connections between trees and their redistribution of carbohydrates amongst tree roots, and also indigenous theorizing, in which those trees are understood as part of a council which make collective decisions. And she manages to blend biology and indigenous ontology and ways of knowing seamlessly to provide an account of a mutual flourishing through which soils, fungus, trees, squirrels, people, all are the beneficiaries of reciprocity. And here, amongst some other First Nations people, ways of being envisage forest trees quite literally as kin, as persons, with particular social places in these more than human worlds. And yet again, these more than human forests archive history and human history. The pecan groves here occupy a landscape First Nations people have undergone deeply violent subjugation and decline. And over the past century in particular, there's been the enforced movement of people into reservations and into individualized forms of land tenure, which have disrupted people's entanglements with land and the mutual benefits they'd have from them. A heritage documented in museums like this one, but also lived. The remaining pecan groves offer forms of reciprocity and mutuality that have been lost in many other areas of life. And it's not therefore surprising that the synchronization of the Potawatomi Gathering of Nations is aligned with the synchronization of the mass fruiting of the trees, something that's important both materially to feed the gathering as people come together, but also recalling a kind of mutual flourishing in this more than human world, marking that both symbolically and in ritual. But one doesn't have to travel so far from places like here, where we are in Cambridge, to find this kind of convivial forest lifeway. They're here in Europe, and they're here in Southeast England too. And they're here amongst industrial urbanites, as many of us these days are, although often obscured and delegitimized by the kind of formal science and education that we're brought up to take them seriously. So take just briefly Southeast UK, where we are at the moment, where historical ecologies of forest and woodlands, like those of Oliver Rackham and his students here in Cambridge, in places like Haley Wood, not far from here, have again debunked narratives of one-way forest disturbance and shown the kind of layered legacies of management on current woodland patterns and composition. And the moves that we now see in places like Southeast UK towards forest protection in national parks, nature reserves, and to encourage tree regeneration and woodland and enrichment planting as parts of efforts of landscape restoration, as everywhere, lock into and build on these past legacies, whether in soil and vegetation conditions or whether in tenurial conditions and the social memories that are wrapped up with those. And the resulting forests too, I would argue, are often experienced in what I'm calling more than human, convivial, relational ways. I can get very personal here. My family and I started to plant trees in old pasture on our small holding in the South Downs a few years ago. And over time, we've experienced the oak, the hawthorn, the beech, the hazels, and other saplings growing slowly, often a bit challenged by rabbits and other things. The undergrowth has thickened, and numerous birds and insects have become regular inhabitants and visitors. This is a place that's gradually becoming a woodland, a forest. And we observe as we do and wander and sit amongst all of this, finding ourselves not doing so just with scientific detachment, but also with pleasure and with a kind of emotional engagement that often surprises ourselves, feeling that this nascent forest is almost like a community of kin, one we nurture and care for, and which feels like a kind of extension of our own human social world. For many people, forests are far less familiar, and yet they satisfy desires also to be in the unfamiliar, enabling perhaps a switch and a difference from everyday life, which might be more urban, occupied by work routines, habitual daily worlds. An opportunity to perhaps to connect, if perhaps fleetingly, in a kind of more than human community. And I'm wondering if this helps understand the appeal of what are now quite actively promoted as forest immersions, like this one here, which claims to draw its origins from a particular, in this case, Japanese philosophy, but is also advertised on science websites. In fact, this particular forest immersion version is being promoted by the Royal Botanical Gardens of Kew. So there's a blending there of what we might see as mainstream science and something that's more emotional and more connected. And perhaps one might suggest that it's these sort of curated, immersive experiences that they work precisely because they are social. They enable people to engage with a lively relational place. Maybe also a sense of connection with the historical legacy that shape those places. Maybe this is part of what makes us feel good or refreshed or revitalized, or the many kinds of things that one feels when on a walk or sitting in a forest. And people will feel different things. But whatever the precise emotion, I think the point is that there is emotion. And again, this is much more than just livelihoods. So a few stories, but they all illustrate in different ways what I'm terming forest lifeways. So to come to sort of draw to some implications, what might we see as the implications for conservation justice? I think there are three. The first turns particularly to this question of history and their legacies. They shape people's interactions with forest assemblages, and how people respond, and how vegetation and non-human inhabitants respond sets the stage for further impacts and responses. And external interventions always interlock with those. A forest like Gola becomes an archive of, yes, farming, the slave trade, colonial wars, timber, cocoa, civil war, epidemics of Ebola, as well as a history of reservation and conservation for timber, then biodiversity, and now carbon too. And each of those leaves its mark on vegetation quality and also on social memories and the claims that follow from that. I'm wondering if we need to go a bit further to recognise those as part of conservation justice, something we might think of as more reparative, something that's about restoring historical injustices, or at least recognising them as part of what we might term restorative modes of justice. The second set of implications turn to these arguments about ways of being in a more than human world. That forest assemblages are often experienced as these emplaced, more than human multi-species communities of animals, of plants, of soils, of spiritual beings. And these are obviously culturally variant in the notions of what's there, why it matters, is a person, and so on. But the point is that they're always relational, and people live amongst them, not separate from nature, but as part of what I tend to term these days mind. And the relations, of course, are partly socioeconomic. They do deliver livelihood benefits, they deliver ecosystem services and provisioning benefits, framings that are easily compatible with mainstream conservation, with capitalist conservation, and with the commoditization of forests for carbon and biodiversity credits. But thriving on well-being can depend more deeply too on the kind of ongoing ordering of these more than human communities and worlds. Appreciating that, I think, is going to be quite important to co-designing interventions if community engagement is really to find its place, if it's to be properly respectful and appreciative of how people live, of their ways of being. And this suggests the need for attention to what we might term ontological justice, justice amongst different ways of being, and also perhaps multi-species justice, which recognises the subject of justice and conservation, not just as human communities, but sometimes those communities that involve the interlocking of humans and non-humans in multi-species communities. And this, I think, creates some really interesting opportunities to engage with emerging legal frameworks around Earth jurisprudence and around the rights of nature. And then finally, I think there are implications for ways of knowing and therefore for knowledge and evidence. It's so important what we do here. Kind of backstaging the assumption that people only or inevitably disturb natural vegetation like forests opens up, I think, new possibilities to identify, appreciate and build on local practices of enrichment, regeneration, restoration. This is much more than indigenous knowledge as a kind of technical knowledge applied intentionally. It also encompasses ways of knowing a more cultural, social, embedded in experience, and often less conscious. They're about a flow of life onto which people hitch on. And to understand those, socioeconomic surveys, participatory livelihood matter are great, but they only get us so far. I think we need to think harder about triangulating with evidence that's historical, ethnographic, and perhaps also with the modes of arts, visual, oral, musical, that relate stories in culturally embedded ways. So finally, this points to, I think, the need for epistemic justice and for several further forms of justice to come into what we're trying to do as we work to make sure that conservation helps to build what I like to think of these days as a politics of hope and a politics of care. Sort of adding them into this little diagram, a lifeways lens suggests that we might want to expand our recognition of justice, not just to be about recognising which stakeholders ought to be at the table, that we need to have gender and ethnicity and different social groups, but that we also need to include recognition to ways of knowing and perhaps ways of being as well. For who, the equity of what and between whom comes to include different kinds of more than human multi-species communities, which will need to be deliberated about in relation to other kinds of equity. And attention to history adds this dimension of restorative justice. All of this, I think, foregrounds power, perhaps in a more thoroughgoing way, in all its manifestations, both the material power, the political economy, and sometimes sheer violence that is often enwrapped with lifeways and the modes that suppress them, but also the discursive power that means that some stories often prevail over others, including, I think, those more narrow mechanistic stories, the economistic stories that obscure some of those that I've been trying to reveal that tell us of forest lifeways. So I think if we're going to foster and safeguard hopeful futures for forests and their more than human inhabitants, we need to pay a little bit more attention to these. Despite the urgency, despite the challenges, I think those things shouldn't be to gloss over what I think will end up being crucially important in building futures in which everybody in forest.
I think we're going to open the floor to questions for about 15 minutes or so, and Melissa will also over to you, the audience, to raise your hand and ask a question.
very much. It was a really fascinating talk. You felt like the historic cultural knowledge was continuing to be passed down beyond the elders in the places that you experienced, the places that you went.
Lisa, do you want to just repeat the question in case?
So it's a question from Ruth about whether the sort of historical cultural knowledge I was talking about was continually passed down between genders. I think the answer is that it's not necessarily, and that's not just because people, and not mostly because people don't listen to their elders. Certainly in the West African worlds I've been part of, and amongst the indigenous people like the Potawatomi, as it were, the wisdom of the elders is enormously important to value. But I think people are not, sort of more recent generations are not necessarily seeing those stories and those ways of knowing and being as deeply relevant to how people are living now. And it's not to say that people aren't still living them, but they're also, as it were, constantly exposed to worldviews which are very different, which say this forest is a place which we can commoditize for carbon. This is a place that needs to be conserved because its biodiversity is out there. There are forms of education in science that have been very deeply absorbed and are often kind of shown to people and that people engage with them through conservation practice and through the forms of communication that go along with those. So it's not that things are not passed down, but in as much as they are passed down, I think people often put them in a box as something a little bit archaic, and their everyday experiences was actually keep these things alive if they would only think about them. They don't necessarily see as relevant to the current kind of conservation world that they're part of. Yeah.
Yeah, Simi Benzen from the RSPB. Thank you very much for that interesting talk, Melissa. I guess your the examples you show in West Africa are quite translatable, especially to a country like Cameroon, where I come from.
Yeah.
And a quick question really is looking at what could be the potential tensions or synergies between global conservation priorities and those lifeways, as you've shown in those West African lower Guinean countries, and how might this influence the long-term pursuit for sustainability and justice for those communities?
Great question. The argument that I'm trying to make is actually that they're not in tension. So there could be a tension between a view that says, okay, there are global priorities to conserve and protect forests for biodiversity and carbon, and then an assumption that the people who are living with forests are destroying it and working against those priorities. And it's actually that view of tension that often, that kind of separation that often drives mainstream practices of conservation, of commoditization of nature, which almost assumes that people are separate from this natural world and need to be almost kind of sort of bought off or persuaded or enabled to protect through livelihood benefits or through governance arrangements. The argument I'm trying to make is slightly different. It's to say that actually these entanglements between people, in this case forests, are there and they've always been there. And they give one the grounds to recognize and build practices for the future that actually can be great for biodiversity and great for people, and actually need to be given more thoroughgoing space. It also enables us to recognize that some of the political economic pressures and the drivers of deforestation and forest loss usually aren't with the communities who've been living in and with these places, but are coming from commercial agriculture, foreign direct investment in in mining, in the many wider political economic drivers of change, which are impinging on both forests and the communities who live with them. So I think that's the way I'd slightly rephrase that argument. So I think there's a lot to work with. I think there are really grounds for hope in working with and even more fully with forest communities, which I mean, CCI partners already do, and all I think I would be suggesting is that we can go a little bit further to understand and recognise perhaps what one would need to respect and foreground if we genuinely need to build these more hopeful, positive stories together. Gosh, lots of questions now. Yeah, it's the front. Yeah.
This is from the online viewers.
Yeah.
So this is Jeremy Linsell from A Rocha. Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. What do you think would help Western conservationists who are stuck in a materialist mindset give value to those metaphysical aspects of lifeways that you have shown are so important?
Great question. I think the answer is twofold. One is to appreciate that the ways of knowing and ways of being that we've all been educated into and are kind of taught to practice as conservation practitioners are not the only way, and just to kind of open up to kind of recognizing and appreciating these other ways of knowing and being, which can happen through listening, through some of these methods which are properly attentive to ways of knowing and being. The second is for conservation professionals, and I will put myself in that box there too, to look inside ourselves and to realize that there is something of the everyday relationality with the more than human, with these natures that are all around us, in everybody. How often do we parcel off our work as conservationists from the companion relations we might have with our pets, with our dogs and cats, or the ways we might relate to the trees or the soils we're involved in our gardening every day? If we were to allow ourselves to realize that these kind of more than human experiences and more emotional entanglements are actually there for all of us, perhaps that enables us again to be more appreciative of those peoples for whom those kind of more than human relations have never gone away, have always been absolutely germane. Maybe Hashimi, and then I'll come to you. Yeah.
Just a bit connected to this gentleman's question.
Yeah.
Conservation leaders are kind of encouraged to think about including these traditional ways of conservation in kind of how they lead and stuff.
Yeah.
But do you think on a global scale, what is your opinion? Do you think we could still do conservation, or rather treat these traditional lifeways as the way that we do conservation? Or are we too far removed from it already that we have to start by starting to integrate, and then maybe, of course, it won't be applicable to a lot of, like, for instance, urban areas and stuff like that, which are recognizably too far removed. But in other areas, how far do you think we would have to go to actually do conservation this way?
I think we can go very far. Okay, so I would argue quite strongly that these sorts of more than human lifeways are neither traditional, as in something not traditional in the sense of something of the past, something archaic, but are here and now, and all of us are living them in one way or another, however much we occlude that by the kind of ways of thinking we're kind of forced into. And secondly, that they're everywhere. So some of the broader work I've been doing, not about forests, has been exploring these kind of connectivities in urban environments as well, where people's connections with the animal and plant life in the green spaces, in the buildings, in the cracks and crannies, in and amongst their houses and their buildings are also sources of connection, which are often, good evidence shows, important to people's mental health and well-being. So I think this argument can go quite a long way. What it is, and I think it can scale up. So on the one hand, one's saying, yes, attention to the place-based entanglements that are crucial to people and nature is important. That's always going to have to be local. But if we want to think about scaling up big conservation, that has and the kind of transformations towards greater sustainability, that often has to build up from below. It can't be imposed from the top down. And if we look at the movements, the activism, the social movements, the forces for political change, which are beginning to challenge those political economies that are frankly doing in and destroying non-human natures, then some of those most powerful politics actually bubble up from all sorts of smaller places of connectivity. So I think there are grounds for saying pathways of change can emerge from these lifeways. And they need to be added up and extended and recognized globally, as well as in small local places.
One last question.
Don't know who to go to. Maybe I'll take those two because you've both got your hands up, and I'll come back to both of them.
Jim Bridgestone from RSPB.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Leach, for an incredibly interesting lecture. You mentioned a couple of times the term conviviality as a sort of conceptual framework and even a practice which tries to overcome these human nature divisions which you've been speaking about. It made me think of the work that Bram Boucher and Robert Fletcher's done on convivial conservation, which they outline in their book, Conservation Revolution.
Yeah.
I wondered how much you had engaged with and perhaps what you see the crossover is between convivial conservation and the lifeways, which you've been outlining.
That's great. I will come back to that, but maybe I'll just take this last one as well. I don't know if it's related, but
it's not quite related. It's about, I thought it was fascinating your like deconstructing these narratives and also your invoking of like decolonial justice in terms of conservation. And I was wondering how you envision the role of institutions like Cambridge, which have historical connections to colonization in this process, right, of centering these like lifeways.
Yeah, great. I think those two questions actually do relate to each other. So the way I'm using conviviality here owes more to anthropologists like Nyamjo who use it for describing these kind of friendly co-living relations amongst all beings. And also in his version, there's a sort of conviviality in the ways of acting and the ways of acting and knowing amongst those different beings. So that's his notion of conviviality. It's really what I'm drawing here. Then there is, of course, I'm very familiar with Bram Boucher and Robert Fletcher's work on convivial conservation. And their framework, I think, does use the term convivial as part of a claim to being inspired by these convivial relations that you find often amongst indigenous communities, pastoralists, people at the margins of the world. But I don't actually think that the framework for convivial conservation goes far enough to recognize and bring in these diverse dimensions of justice that I'm talking about now. So that's it's a useful framework for thinking, but basically it sort of stitches different things together. And there's one box which is about appreciating kind of indigenous lifeways, but then they're also slightly put over here as indigenous and separate, rather than something that's part of all of this, as I'm trying to suggest. That'd be a response there. And this does, of course, link back to decolonization. Important term, but to me, an imperative to do the kind of thing that I think my collaborators and colleagues have always tried to do from our research, albeit often from places of power, universities like Cambridge and Sussex, which is to deconstruct the narratives, challenge the hierarchies of power, of knowledge, of disciplines that produce them and uphold them, to appreciate how those go back often to colonization, quite literally colonization, but also to forms of colonization that take place through appropriation of ways of knowing. And so one could argue that the sort of justice framework that kind of suggested there are all parts of something you might call colonial environmental justice. I choose not to label it that way because I also recognise that decolonization needs to be a multi-stranded conversation in which the positionality of those making those claims is also quite contested. I mean, I think it's quite reasonable to say people sitting in Cambridge should not be leading a debate on decolonization or defining what it is. Or equally, I'm aware that sometimes discussion of decolonization, especially from positions of power, can almost sound a bit colonial, actually. I've experienced that in my earlier work at IDS, where the discussion was about decolonizing development, or my work on global health, where we always talk about decolonizing global health. And often the response from colleagues and partners in the African settings where I've worked would be, we don't want to talk about decolonization. That's actually quelling our agency, and we'd rather talk about equity and justice in our partnerships, in our ways of knowing being. So I think this is part of decolonizing conservation, and could be part of an important debate, but that debate remains and needs to be, I think, stranded.
We will stop there. Before we thank Melissa last time, I'd just like to let you know that next week, Professor Rob Fletcher at the Department of Zoology will be giving his talk called A Well-Connected Earth, which may well have some interesting connections to what we've heard today as well. I'm sorry we've gone slightly over time. Hopefully we're just into your lunch break rather than your meeting. But that was a fantastic lecture. Thank you so much, Melissa, for sharing your thoughts. Lots of interesting questions from the audience as well. And I'm sure we'll have great conversations in the next half hour as well. So let's say thank you very much.